2, 3, and 4. All right. Welcome to the Life Point Table Talk podcast. We are continuing today with our Bible reading reflections. My name is Jason, and I have the lovely Pastor Katrina.
Thank you. It's so good to be here today.
And today we are on week 4, and we're looking at Matthew 15 through 19 and Exodus 1 through 18. So hopefully some of y'all are following along with us on this, but if you're not, that's okay too. Just tune in, check out the podcast. So this week we want to do it a little different. We've been normally starting in the Old Testament, and there's usually so much to cover there that we get stuck there, and then the New Testament ends up, and then Jesus did some stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of rushing through that part.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Today we want to start with the New Testament. So we're going to start here looking at Matthew 15.
And we're continuing to talk about the ministry of Jesus because that's what the Gospels is all about, is the ministry of Jesus. And it's so interesting how that each Gospel writer interweaves the ministry of Jesus and all that he did. Mm-hmm. It fascinates me. I mean, it wasn't just that he was preaching. I mean, he was confronting, he was teaching, he was in everyday life. So Jesus was an all-around person. That's what I love about him.
Yeah.
And that's the example we have. So you see right in the beginning here that Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he really confronts them because he tells them, you're teaching the traditions of men as God's commandment. And then he tells them why. He quotes Isaiah the prophet. It's Isaiah 29:13. He said, you're doing this because you honor God with your lips or with your words, but your heart is far from God. Now, That's a confrontation.
Well, it's interesting. They're confronting him, usually. They're following him around, coming after him. And it's usually over some good deed.
Yeah.
Too, which
healing
is
on the Sabbath. How dare you?
Healing or having something to eat or, these kinds of things.
But I don't think he did it harshly. I think he really spoke to them in compassion. And that's what threw them off.
Yeah.
I don't think he said, you, and point his finger at them. I think he spoke to him in compassion.
Well, even if he did, they
didn't take it that way,
didn't take it very well.
No.
It seems like it keeps saying, and then they planned to kill him.
Yes.
After every time. But he's starting to flip things around to pointing people to the heart, to look at the heart instead of just the rules.
Yes, that's the beautiful thing about it.
Yeah.
It's the heart.
And we come into this interesting part with the Canaanite woman.
Yes.
Who's asking Jesus to deliver her daughter. She's possessed. And I thought it was really interesting because Jesus' response is sort of different in this situation, in that he says, I'm here to speak to the people of Israel. And even the disciples are kind of trying to shoo her away.
Yeah, get her away.
But she's persistent. And eventually he says, okay. He goes back on what he initially sort of said because of her faith.
But it's interesting. He said to her, am I to feed the dogs? And we think of that, oh, wow, what an insult. Mm-hmm. But she says to him, and this is so interesting, she says, well, don't the dogs at least get the crumbs from the table? And we think of a stray dog. That's not a stray dog. That's a family dog that's loved. Mm-hmm. Under the table, waiting for the crumbs from the family. Mm-hmm. And the family loves him so much. Each one of them's throwing him little things, so throwing the dog something, the pet, something under the table.
Yeah.
And he saw her faith.
Yeah.
He saw her faith. That was her faith. So I think that's fascinating.
Also in chapter 15, we have he feeds 4,000.
Yes, here's the wonderful thing about this. said Jesus had compassion on them because they had been 3 days and had not eaten
Yeah.
just to hear him teach.
Yeah,
Now, if you preach beyond 30 minutes, people saying, I'm hungry, I got to get out of here.
Right.
And they've been 3 days without food, and he said, we need to feed them. So this time, it's 4,000 plus women and children. So it's many more than 4,000 with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish.
Right.
And there's always leftovers. When Jesus, there's always abundance.
Yeah.
There's 7 baskets full left over. And that's the wonderful thing about Jesus. He doesn't just give just barely enough. There's always an abundance with the Lord.
Yeah.
So
Then we move on to 16 here. He talks about understanding the times at the beginning there.
again, we have the Pharisees and Sadducees. They want a sign now from Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think it's interesting that he said, your sign is the sign of Jonah?
Mm.
Wonder what they thought about that. What do you think of when you think of Jonah?
3 days in the well.
3 days in the belly of the fish,
Yeah.
and then he was resurrected.
Right.
And he said, that's your sign. And you'll see, 3 days I'll be in that belly, but you'll see me come out.
Mm-hmm.
That's your sign.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
He really is just cool. And he warns the disciples to watch out for their teaching. And then we have the revelation.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite, probably favorite portions of the New Testament here, this part with Peter.
Peter, open mouth, insert foot.
Well, wait, is this, let's see, is this where he says, who do you say I am?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. This is my favorite part, because Jesus is talking to him. Peter's saying what other people say he is.
Yeah, who do men say that I am?
And then Jesus gets it down to him.
Yeah.
Who do you say I
Yeah.
am?
And that's the most important thing for all of us. It's
Yeah.
not what the world says about Jesus. What do you say about
Right.
Jesus?
And he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.
Phew. That's the revelation.
He says that revelation came from Father God, not from his own mind
Right.
as well. And then he goes on to say, upon this rock, I will build my church. I've seen a lot of different commentary on this. I like the idea of the rock being that revelation
Yes.
that they were just talking about. Without that cornerstone of Jesus as Messiah, Son of the living God,
Right.
there is no church.
There is no church.
You take that part
and
out.
Peter's name means little rock.
Mhm.
But when he said upon this rock, it meant the huge foundational rock, not Peter.
Right, and so
And that's
people
the
have,
revelation.
some people have taken it
Yeah.
as that.
On this rock.
And then again, Jesus foretells his death, that he will return in glory. It's amazing how many times he talks about this, and everybody's still shocked,
I know it.
totally taken off
All
guard.
through. But it's like he just mentions it as he's talking.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just talking about upon this rock. And oh, by the way, I'm going to die
Well,
and
what's-
be 3 days in the grave and resurrect. And they go, oh, okay. And
Well,
then,
in this part, which is awesome, because Peter's one of my favorites. You talk about insert foot. He goes from this, transcendent revelation of Jesus as Messiah. Then Jesus talks about having to die, and Peter is trying to tell him no,
I know.
talking him out of it, and Jesus rebukes him and calls him the devil.
yeah,
Like
get behind me, devil.
2 verses later, after this great revelation,
That's the honesty of Jesus.
Yeah,
He won't let them get by with it.
right.
He makes them, goes back to the heart.
Yeah.
Look at the heart.
Yeah.
No, Peter, you're not thinking right. You're not thinking right. I love it.
Right.
Right, love it.
And we move on to Matthew 17. This is an amazing part here with the transfiguration.
Oh, yes.
And it talks about, it says, there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses, Elijah talking with Jesus.
Look, the Old and the New came together.
Yeah.
The Old Testament and the New Testament came together. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, this is some kind of experience here.
It's amazing. And here Peter again. Oh, I know what we'll do. Let's build 3 tabernacles.
Yeah, it's
one for
really
you, one for Moses, one for Elijah.
I think
and
it
God
even
corrects
says he
him.
didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah, he was like, this would be nice. Let's build 3 tabernacles while we're up here.
And he just kind of interrupts him, like he's not, don't pay attention to him, and just
listen to Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what God said. Listen to my son. Listen to Jesus.
Right.
But here's the fascinating thing. They're on the mountain, the transfiguration, and they come down out from the mountain, and what happens? Here's a man that has a son that's demon-possessed. From the mountain experience to demon possession.
Right.
And you may think of it as, oh my goodness, that's terrible. But it's our preparation with God, being on the mountain with him, with the Lord, that prepares us for the real world when we step out into it.
Right.
Because there's a lot of demonic things going on in this world.
Yeah.
But the disciples that hadn't gone up on the mountain with him couldn't cast the devil out. So Jesus talks to him about faith, and he said, if you even had mustard seed faith, have you ever seen mustard seed? It's a tiny little thing.
Right.
He said, but this kind comes out by fasting and prayer. So this is another step beyond just being saved. This is another step into the power of God to deliver this boy.
Right.
So
then we go right into 18, and Jesus is talking about children. I think it's is this part or the next part? Or no, that's later. The children come to him.
This is when he sits a little child in their midst.
Yeah.
And says, they ask, who's the greatest in the kingdom? He sits a little child there. Can you imagine how insulting that was to adults? But we're going back to what? The heart. We're going back. What's a little child like? There's an innocence. There's a trust. There's a belief.
Yeah, I think too. If you're looking for it, he's continually bringing things back to faith.
Yes.
Too, and for me, there's that innocence, yes, with the child, but there's also the faith, the trust,
that childlike faith.
Yeah.
If you tell your child you're going to do something, buddy, they believe you, and you better do it because they'll remind you if you don't.
Yeah. And
the parable of the lost sheep.
Yes.
That God so loves that he will even go after the one that strays. That's the love of God.
I mean, that's one of the most famous portions of the New Testament there. It's right there in 18.
And then it talks about if people trespass against you, forgive them. It's very interesting. I'll give you this real quickly. Actually, forgiving others should be a way of life. But trespassing, there's a difference between trespass and transgress. Trespass means if you accidentally, not on purpose, hurt somebody's feelings or hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, forgive them. Even if they transgress against you, which means they did it on purpose, forgive them.
Right.
So it doesn't matter which way it is, accidentally or on purpose, walk in forgiveness.
Yeah, and this is a part where Peter asked him, should we forgive 7 times? Again, classic. I love that. And it's a very honest, when can I stop forgiving kind of question. How many times? And Jesus gives kind of a crazy...
7 times 7?
Yeah, it was just, like saying 1,000,000 times kind of thing. And then he gives this, one of my favorite parables about the king who forgives the debt.
Yes.
And to me, this is one of the best lessons in the Bible on forgiveness.
Yeah.
Because it really doesn't let anybody off the hook.
No, it doesn't.
Because your transgression against God was forgiven. You're now obligated, no matter what, to continue that forgiveness because you were forgiven.
And we think ours isn't as great as somebody else's, but that's not true. In the sight of God, all sin is the same. It's you've sinned, and the sin really is against God, not accepting His Son.
Yeah.
And because of that, you act out in terrible ways.
Yeah.
So forgiveness, absolutely.
Well, it's also interesting because the power, I think, to forgive is in that story as well, in that you focus on the King and his grace toward you.
Yes.
That's where you'll find the power to have grace towards other people.
I think John said, "Forgive others as Christ has forgiven you." And boy, when you think about that,
Right.
you walk in forgiveness.
Yeah.
And it's not worth it to carry it anyway.
Yeah.
Who's it hurting? You.
It's a dangerous thing to do.
You set other people
free. In
free.
fact, the story doesn't end too well, the parable he gives.
No.
Because the guy ends up in jail, thrown in jail.
Well, and that's what it is. If you hold unforgiveness, you are in jail. You're bound by that.
Yeah.
You are.
That's good.
You are. Oh, here's one important principle in Matthew 18, and it's verse 20. Jesus, just out of the blue, seems like, he said, "When 2 or 3 of you gather together in my name, I want you to know I'm in the midst." And how many times have we used that?
What do you think? Why do you think he said it like that? Obviously, there are examples before this of people on their own having faith.
Yeah.
But he's pointing out coming together. Something
I think
special
because there were such multitudes that he's saying to them, it doesn't have to be a multitude for me to be there. I'll come if just 2 of you are together. If just 2 of you start talking about me, I'll show up. And especially after he was gone, that would come back to them because he wrote it.
Right.
Hey, if we gather in his name, he'll be here.
Right.
His presence will be here.
Yeah.
So that I think that's so cool.
Yeah. It's awesome. We can move on here to 19.
Yeah, we have the great multitudes following Jesus again, and Jesus heals them. And then he talks to the Pharisees about marriage and divorce.
Yeah, I don't want to get super into this, but I do think it's interesting how Jesus, the ideal that he's looking at, again, he's using the Old Testament.
Yes.
First of all, the scriptures that were there. And he's also pointing to Adam and Eve as the ideal situation. And then it gets really interesting because they bring up Moses and his accommodation for divorce. And the disciples' answer is basically, it's better not to get married at all.
Yeah.
You can't get divorced.
But
like
Jesus,
that kind of
I love what
honesty.
Jesus said. The reason the divorce was allowed was because of the hardness of their hearts.
Right.
It wasn't because of just what was going on in that marriage. Their hearts had become hard toward each other and just toward God, really.
Yeah.
And that's what broke the marriage.
Yeah. And this is the part I was talking about earlier where the children come to him.
Yes.
And the disciples try to shoo them away. But what I think is interesting is kids liked him.
That is so cool because several times it mentions about children.
Because sometimes it's hard to totally get his personality. He talks about love a lot, but then he seems real harsh sometimes, and you try to envision what Jesus' personality was like. But whatever his personality was, it attracted children.
Yeah.
So I don't think, they're not usually attracted to, grumpy
Old men.
sad people. You know what I mean? There must have been a level of joy and levity there that they wanted to be
I think a lot of
around
things
them.
Jesus said were jokes, were sarcasm in
Right.
a way.
Yeah.
Maybe we'd call it sanctified sarcasm.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree with you. And as soon as the disciples said that, he said, "No, you let the children come to me."
Right.
And it said he laid his hands on them, he prayed over him, he blessed them. And then he reminded the adults, he said, this is if you want to partake of the kingdom of God, you become like these little kids,
Yeah.
these little children.
Yeah.
And again, he brings that back.
Yeah.
And it's talking about the heart.
Right.
Have that trust. Look how they trust me. They want to be here on my lap. They want to be here having me hug them and put my hands on them.
Right.
Do you want that?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And then immediately, what do you have? The rich young ruler. He saw this and he goes, I want this eternal life you're talking about. How do I get it?
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing what Jesus says to him? Well, go sell everything you got and give to the poor.
But I think it's interesting, too, it doesn't start there. The guy pushes it.
Yes, he does. You're right.
He does. That's not his first response to him. He just tells him to follow the commandments.
Yeah.
And the guy, I don't think he did perfectly, like he's acting like he did. Like, oh, yeah, I've already done all that.
Oh, yes. I've
Yeah.
kept those commandments.
I've done it all.
Self-righteous.
Perfectly. And I think because maybe there was something there that sort of pushed Jesus to really point out his weak spot.
Yep.
And just immediately sort of cut to the chase and, this is where you really are, buddy.
Heart. Went to the heart.
The heart. And another part that's interesting to me is Jesus talks about how it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom. And I think a lot has been kind of said about that. But what I think is interesting is the disciples' response to that is not like, yeah, those rich people, they're the worst or whatever. They say, well, who can?
Yeah. Well, some of these disciples were businessmen.
Yeah, this wasn't just an anti-rich thing. To them, they didn't take it that way. They took it as just, wow, we're all going to need some help here kind of thing. And then he says anything's possible with God. Yeah.
And the whole thing, I think he was saying to this rich young ruler and to everyone that was there, you can't trust in your riches to get to heaven.
Yeah.
It's not your position in life that gets you to heaven.
Right.
It's your trust in the Lord.
Right.
So, well, and then Jesus, I love this at the end of this chapter, we'll end Matthew here, he emphasizes the eternal rewards for being faithful. He said, if you're faithful, then you'll get rewards too. Don't think that, and he was saying that, I think, even for the rich young ruler.
Yeah.
You have more rewards than just your money you're holding in your hands.
Right.
100-fold.
Yeah.
100-fold. So I think he was saying to him, if you'll start giving, you'll find out how I will bless you.
Yeah, I love this. I'll read this portion here where it's Matthew 19:29 through 30. He says, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers or wives or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first.
Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing. The idea of 100-fold family.
Yeah.
Family members, people who are as close as they can get. And he talks about fields, too. I mean, that's property, that's things, that's money.
Anything you give up for me, I'll give back to you.
Friends.
And we found that out when we started the church with nothing and sowed that, and look how God is blessed.
Yeah.
He said, blessed you here and eternal life. So that meant he would bless even here in this life.
Right.
So fascinating.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to end there. We're going to do a two-parter because there's just so much to cover here with this portion of Scripture in the Old and New. So that was the new portion, and we'll come back and cover the Old. We're getting into Exodus, which is some really rich stuff I don't want to just skim over.
Okay.
So we'll come back to that for part 2. So thanks for tuning in. Tune back in for part 2. Goodbye. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome, everybody, to the Life Point Table Talk podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Pastor Katrina.
Hello, good to be with you today.
And today we are going to do part 2. Well, we just did part 1. We're going to do part 2 of week 4. Where we just did Matthew 15 through 19, and on this portion we're going to do Exodus 1 through 20, or Exodus 1 through 18. And I didn't want to skim over this, so we're splitting it up this week. So Genesis ends with Joseph's death, and before he dies, he proclaims God will take them to the promised land, as God had promised to Abraham.
Yeah, and the word Exodus, by the way, means to exit or come out of or erode. So this is the deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt, and it's their journey to Mount Sinai and the events that take place during their journey there. The book of Genesis emphasis was on Abraham and his family, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. But Exodus focuses on the developing nation of Israel. The main theme of Exodus is redemption. And what do I mean by that? It's the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, which is a type of redemption, and then Moses leading them is a type of Christ. So when you look at it that way, it really becomes an interesting journey when you see it like that.
Yeah, and I think too, I forget what this, maybe Hebrews or something. They're talking about how this whole story here of deliverance and into the promised land is an example for us.
Yes, absolutely.
The church and Christians in our
Hebrews
lives
4 talks about
to pay close attention to the lessons learned throughout the story. So it's really important. So Joseph dies. Everybody at the time, there was a famine. We ended there.
Yeah.
Everybody came to Egypt, and the Israelites came to Egypt as well.
And the king, the Pharaoh there, and Joseph really blessed the children of Israel, gave them great land for their herds because they were shepherds. But Exodus 1 begins right out. A new king came in. He did not know Joseph, and the Israelites were multiplying, and he feared them. Mm-hmm. So what'd he do? He put them into slavery.
Yeah, it's crazy because it's the same weird story of a person or a people who are blessed, and people can't take it.
You're right.
Israel is here blessed and multiplying in numbers, and the Egyptians get fearful.
Yep, they do.
And probably resentful, too.
Resentful. I think that's a good word.
Yeah.
And in order, the king puts out a new order to reduce the Israelites' population, and that all baby boys, as soon as they're born, are to be killed.
Yeah.
And that's a type of abortion, really.
Yeah, and, well, I just want to point that out here because sometimes I think we gloss over some of these more extreme parts, but to me, I appreciate the level of honesty because there is so much brutality in the world, and you see it through the whole
all through the Bible,
and you actually see this same thing later when Jesus is born.
Absolutely. The king has all the little baby boys.
Yeah, where there's this fear of them rising up, so they try to kill all the kids.
Yeah. It's the baby boys. Notice that, the baby boys. But God always has someone. The midwives here who said they feared God, and they started saving these babies that were born. And they told the king, well, they just have them so fast, we just can't get there, and they hide them.
I thought it was interesting, too. It says they were blessed because of that.
Yes.
Because they saved these kids. It had to point out that these midwives were blessed for saving these children.
Whenever you do right, God takes recognition of it.
Yeah, and so we get to the story of Moses, which is interesting, a little hard for me to fully understand this story. He gets put in a basket and
Put in the river
put down the
Nile.
river. It's pretty wild.
He's crying like a little baby would do. Pharaoh's
And
daughter is touched.
yeah, she finds him and
She knows he's Hebrew. It's
takes
not
him
like she
in.
doesn't know.
Yeah, she asks for them to help.
Yeah. Oh, here's his sister Miriam. Do you need someone to nurse him?
Right.
I just happened to have somebody. Pharaoh's daughter wasn't stupid. She knew that was
Right.
his mother.
Right.
But she kept him.
So I think
And
what's
so he
interesting.
was raised in the palace.
Yeah, that's interesting too because Joseph was kind of the same.
Yes.
He had this religious upbringing with his family, but then he was also very educated in this other culture and system, and he understood it very well.
I'm glad
and
you brought that out. I never thought of that. That's beautiful.
and I think Moses did as well. He knew the culture. He knew
Yes, he did.
their education system and all that kind of stuff.
And of course, when he's grown, he sees the persecution. He tries to help his people
Yeah,
and himself, so he kills an Egyptian.
yeah,
And that didn't go over very well with Pharaoh.
yeah,
So he has to flee. Isn't it interesting? Moses becomes a shepherd. I think that's so interesting to
Yeah.
me. From being in a palace to becoming a shepherd. And he marries and then has two sons.
yeah,
But during this time, what's happening? The children of Israel are crying out to God, and God hears them.
yeah.
And he's already prepared somebody who's a shepherd.
Right.
I think that's so cool.
And so during this time, while they call it the desert, right? He's in a desert, Midian. Am I saying that right? Midian. And he gets married. He's living out there. And while he's a shepherd, he encounters one of the most famous scenes ever is the burning bush.
The burning bush.
And this is where God shows up in a burning bush and tells him to go back to Egypt to free the Israelites. And he's supposed to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go."
And he says,
famous.
but I stutter.
Yeah.
I stutter.
He stutters.
And I love what God says to him. I am that I am. I'm sending you back.
Yeah. Yeah.
But-
It's amazing. Again, the humanity here. This otherworldly experience of God showing up, and he's making excuses not to go.
I think if we all realize our frailty and our dependences on God, that's when God can really use us.
Yeah.
And I think that's what that shows.
And I think too, it's interesting that the other podcast we were talking about how the Pharisees wanted a sign, and I think sometimes the sign or the wonder, if you haven't seen something, you over put more importance on it, what that will do to you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like he's seeing the sign in front of him,
Yeah.
and still
Burning bush.
but still what's in his heart is coming out.
My
He's
fear.
he's afraid and all
Yeah,
this stuff.
yeah.
So, but he accepts finally and decides
God,
to
in
go
chapter
back.
4, he gives Moses power. He shows him the two miracles: the rod that turns into a serpent, the hand that becomes leprous and then is cleansed. And then he sends Aaron, his brother, family. Notice this: Aaron, his brother, to go with him. And
Yeah.
Aaron was a priest. And it's just like Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. God sent them out 2 by 2. So I thought that was interesting.
And so they go back and they talk to Pharaoh, and they tell him what God has told him to do, and Pharaoh's not having it.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. In chapter 6, it said God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and it sounds like, well, God made him hard so he would not let the people go. That doesn't mean that at all. If you look up the word harden, it means he put the squeeze on Pharaoh's heart,
The squeeze.
and what was in Pharaoh's heart came out.
Yeah.
And so what came out of him, he was talking, oh, I'll let them go for a few days. But then when the squeeze, I'm not letting them go at all.
Yeah.
The truth came
What was
out.
really there.
What was really there.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, they initially have this encounter with Pharaoh, and then things actually get worse
Yeah.
for the people of Israel.
And Israel's murmuring again.
and it kind of freaks Moses out,
Yeah.
you know, that, hey, we're trying to do what you said, and now things are even worse. What'd you do to
Have you ever found that out when you're saying, Lord, help me, and then things get worse? You go, what? Why?
Yeah.
Your mess is going to become a message, right?
Yeah. And so then we go into this wild, well, there's all kinds of stuff here. The staffs turn into snakes, and somehow with, what do they call it? Secret arts. Pharaoh's guys have some kind of dark arts too, and they can do snakes as well, and wild stuff there. And then we get to the plagues.
Yeah.
The famous 10 plagues, right?
Yep, 10 plagues.
Got 10 plagues.
Right.
So each time Moses is coming back saying, let them go.
The squeeze, and he won't.
He either says no outright or says okay and doesn't really come through on it. And so I think this is the order. Do you have, I got it here.
The water turns into blood.
Then we got frogs.
Frogs.
Gnats.
Lice.
Oh, you have it, lice?
Lice.
Okay.
And flies.
Flies.
Oh, nasty flies. Then their livestock dies.
Mm-hmm.
Then they get boils, and if you've ever had a boil, there's nothing worse.
Yeah.
Hail with fire, mixed with fire, hitting the earth. Locusts, which are nasty. And then 3 days of total darkness.
Hmm.
And then the final plague.
Yeah.
When
And I think like we were talking about earlier, how Hebrews is talking about how important the lessons are in this story. I think it's the people of Israel, but it's also Pharaoh. The lesson to learn there about your heart, and this guy had 10 warnings.
Yeah. But do you know, none of this came on the children of Israel.
Right.
God protected them, and I think we need to emphasize that.
Right. I'm just talking about him.
I'm talking, yes, but I wanted to bring that out in case I forgot.
Right.
But you would think with the first one.
Yeah.
But I mean, it comes all the way down to the firstborn dying.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people, whether they know it or not, have opportunities to turn around.
Oh, absolutely.
The road signs have been there, and we're just blowing right by them, or
You're right.
It wasn't that bad. It was just flies.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we're over it now.
It's just
They won't last
lice
long.
or boils, and you keep going, and it's.
I think when the firstborn died, I think that his people around him said, "That's it. Don't you dare. You let him go." I think the pressure was on him even from his own people.
I think it says it there. They start pressuring him as well.
And I think that's why they were willing to give all this money and supplies to the Israelis when they were getting ready to leave, is because they said, "We want you out.
Yeah,
Here,
please.
Take this with you so you can go far."
Well, that's what it says. They left with the riches.
They did.
So their oppressors have now bankrolled
them.
their journey.
The finances of the wicked are laid up for the just.
Literally in this situation.
Well, in chapter 12, we learned that the reason the death angel passed over them was the Passover.
Yeah.
The sacrificing of the lamb, the blood on the doorpost, eating the lamb. But it was really, they did that by faith. So it was really faith.
Yeah, that part, especially the Passover, which is a tradition.
And God told him to continue that, to remember his deliverance.
They were assigned to remember that, and they still do today.
And I think anytime we're delivered or come through something with God, we need to mark that and go back and remember that, because the enemy will say, God's never done anything for you. And if you don't mark it in some way, you'll say, no, he hasn't, really. And really, he has.
Yeah.
And that's what God was saying. Don't you ever forget what I did for you.
And it's interesting. This goes all the way to Christ as well.
Absolutely.
Celebrating the Passover.
Absolutely.
And as
right before the crucifixion.
As a foreshadowing of the lamb,
being
and the blood and all that.
Look how much he said. I came to fulfill the law, and you can see it, can't you?
Yeah.
Jesus came to fulfill it. You see it in everything.
It's amazing.
Well, chapter 13, God leads them By day, a pillar of cloud to protect them from the sun, and by night, a pillar of fire to give them warmth. And we've been in the Middle East, and in the day, it's very hot, and at night, it gets really cold. So it's beautiful how they had their own air conditioning and heating system from God.
Yeah.
That's how much He loved them.
Right.
And there were at least 1 million people, probably more than that.
Wow.
Can you imagine feeding that many people for 40 years?
No. It's hard to. I think we all have different mental pictures or what we've seen in a movie or something like that. But I think the reality was pretty wild.
Yeah.
The actual situation on the ground
my
there
goodness,
was
yes.
incredible.
Well, here they've left in chapter 14 now. They're at the Red Sea, and here Pharaoh changes his mind, sends his army after them. So they're between the army and the Red Sea, and they're, of course, petrified. And Moses says, "Fear not,
Yeah.
and see the salvation of the Lord."
Yep.
And I kind of say, God said to him, "Moses, what's in your hand?" A rod.
Yeah.
Stretch it out.
Yep. He had already given it to him.
He had already given it to
Yeah.
him. And showed him how miraculous it was. It turned into a serpent and all that.
Yeah.
Remember that?
So another step of faith here you see
Yeah.
necessary for that deliverance.
And Moses said it before he stretched out the rod. Fear not.
Mm.
Watch the salvation of the Lord. Watch
Yeah.
it. Watch what he's going.
Yeah.
And God used natural wind and made it supernatural. Can you imagine how much wind it took to part the Red Sea?
Yeah. Wild. Wild.
And to make the ground dry?
Mm. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Amazing. Amazing.
And I love they have a song of victory on the other
yeah.
side. It's a
Well, let's
beautiful
mention, though,
portion
when
there.
the armies came in, then the water came back.
Right.
God cut off the wind.
Yeah. They
Yeah, now they're singing songs of victory.
if Pharaoh wouldn't let go all the way to his death.
He didn't.
He followed it all the
I
way
know.
to the
That's
end there.
something.
Couldn't let it
Wow.
go. The
horse and the rider thrown into the sea, the songs of victory. Miriam led that dance with the tambourine.
Yeah.
And then they no sooner get out of victory than they start murmuring again.
Right.
God's brought us out here to kill us.
Yeah. Again, I really think there's a lesson here about the signs that where sometimes you can feel like, God, just show us something or do something. Because I think he learned, well, I don't know if God learned a lesson or we learned a lesson. There were incredible signs in this situation. And people were people still.
People are people.
What came out of their hearts was not any different necessarily.
We just came through the Red Sea. Now we're hungry.
Yeah.
What are you going to do, God?
It's supernatural. And so we get into manna.
Manna, angel food.
Angel food.
He fed them with the food that angels eat.
I don't know why in my head I always think of it as astronaut food.
Oh,
You know,
really?
yeah. I'm sure I'm off here, but I don't know. I had that at the Air Force Museum, and it was just like this kind of weird wafer kind of thing. Didn't taste
Sweet?
that good. No, it was all right.
Well, and the Bible describes it as sweet, has like a sweet flavor, like a corn flavor.
Yeah. But obviously they eventually got tired of whatever it was.
They said, now we need some meat. Okay, we'll give you quail.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how much quail had to come to feed 1 million people
Yeah.
every day
Yeah.
or however often they needed it?
Crazy.
But then they get on in chapter 17. They've been fed by heavenly food and quail, and now they're saying the water's bitter.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good. So they strike the rock, and the water comes from the rock.
Yeah.
And now they're having to have their first battle.
Yeah.
Now they're going to have to fight. They're starting to grow up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, this part, the direction they had to go through the wilderness, because I think if you look at it, the actual trip to the promised land wasn't.
Oh, a few days.
Yeah. But if you look there right at the beginning, it says God had to take them this way because they weren't ready to fight.
That's it. You just said it. They were
They were
not
they were
ready
gonna
to
if they
fight.
went the other way, they were gonna have to fight the Philistines, and they
They weren't ready.
weren't ready.
He protected them, really.
Yeah, so this other journey, it seems weird, but it was actually helping them.
But it didn't have to be 40 years.
Right, exactly.
That shows you what murmuring will do.
Yeah.
And unforgiveness will do. It'll keep the journey longer and harder in your life.
Yeah.
So, but the battle, I love this. When Aaron and Hur lifted up Moses' arms, they would win.
Yeah.
When he was the leader. When their arms came down, then they started losing.
Right.
So they held him up, buddy, until he won.
Yeah, it's
so
amazing.
It tells you to lift up the arms of our leaders. We'll win the battles.
That's fantastic. I think that's a good place to stop here.
I do too.
And just that portion there, that beginning of Exodus, I mean, it's just extraordinarily rich.
It is.
Portion of scriptures that we can
Powerful.
always come back to. And so we'll wrap up there, and we'll come back next week and continue with our Bible reading reflections. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Keep tuning in and checking it out. Peace.